So this is most of the line weight I'll do for my actual drawing. And now the part that people are usually the most interested in is the white markers. So white is something that works really well on this tan paper. So with this tan paper, you can actually take highlights, which I like to use white, and put it on there for a lot of extra contrast. And what this does is it makes the whites really show where your light source is coming from. So for this guy, we're going to use a white paint marker and then a bunch of other ones. Okay. So my favorite ones are basically Faber-Castell paint marker, this, what's it called, Pigment 8 UM153 Signa pen, and then a, what's it called, Sakura Jelly Roll. So these are ones that work really well for really hard lines. And then this guy, the Sakura Permapaque, is great for really thin white lines, which I use for the exterior of my drawings. And then having a bunch of Prismacolor pencils. So these pencils are great, but definitely have a good sharpener. If you try and use them by hand, you'll probably break them, which will drive you crazy. And a quick tip is if you stick them in the microwave for like 2 seconds, it'll actually remelt the core. And if you drop it, they'll shatter. That will fix it back. But if you do it literally more than 2 seconds, they'll explode. So don't do it too long. So what we'll do now is basically go through the same process with the Jelly Roll, which is the one I probably use the most, and start adding highlights. So from here, I want to think about what edges are in the direct path of the light source. And this is where you'll start seeing a lot of actual contrast and where the drawing pretty much starts really coming to life. So what I'll do is I'll put the line down, and then I usually wipe it clean with my finger just because these can get a little jumpy, which means it'll come out pretty smooth in one spot and then it will kind of jam up or clog up. And basically working your way around the whole drawing until every single edge that's catching that light has a white line. And this white line is great because it really helps to separate the darks from the lights. And that is honestly the name of the game, is contrast and thus separating out darkest darks from lightest lights. Okay. Now I want to go down each of the, I'm going to do this one too, each of the ribs on the side of the corrugated metal. So for future reference, corrugated materials take a lot more time just because they require you to put a highlight or a shadow on every single one. But if you do have the patience for it, they do have a really nice effect. And same as the other markers, you want the ones up front to have the most detail and the ones toward the back to get less and less so your attention is not drawn to a super dense, thick area of way too much dark marker towards the back of the object and ultimately the sketch. close to the edge, I'll just make them quicker so you get less and less ink until I don't do any at all on the edges. And now I'm gonna do the same thing for the next area. And then on here, I'm gonna even put a little one that kind of starts and feathers off to nothing, showing where that seam is for each of these panels. And here I'm gonna do the same thing but going up since there's a window right there, so it's gonna get some reflection from that guy. And now I'm gonna go and do the same thing for a little bedroom mezzanine platform area. And now I'm gonna go and do each of the corrugated metal pieces down the side. And then if you want to make them a little easier, just go and take a pencil to do the last few. Just kind of save yourself some time. Do the same thing over here. Now lastly, I'm gonna do on the top, and then this should be done for all of the panels. I also want to have one going down here. One going down the top. So this is what I meant before by being very meticulous and sticking to a hierarchy of just, you can jump around the sketch, but as long as you're doing the same step. That's what I try and recommend everyone does. Okay, so now I'm gonna finish this up real quick, move on to something new. So I'm gonna do the rest with the pencil by hand, just to speed it up. Just putting a little bit explains the rest to people. I want one more right there. There we go. Now that our sketch is mostly filled in, we have all the definition figured out, we have the basics for our highlights in, and the shadowing, we're going to now add some details that are gonna make it pop. So the first thing we're gonna start with is putting my signature white outline around the outside of my sketch. When I first started doing this a few years ago, I used to use the Faber-Castell paint marker. This one is great, but it leaves a very, very hard, fat, thick white line, which I find to be a little distracting now. So I still use this, but later. Now what I use is a Sakura Permapaque paint marker. So this is one that is a little bit more mellow and it's a little more, I don't know, translucent. So it's not as thick when you actually put it around the outside. And the reason I like to put this around my outside is to clean up all those little bits that were from my original drawing. As you can see, 90% of that original C2 marker drawing we did to actually lay the sketch out has been covered up. But the little bits that have not are the pieces that are on the outside. And this is gonna be really subtle. So it's something that helps break that little bit of exposed gray. And frame your actual drawing. So this is also taking advantage of the tan paper. So by having a little white edge on it, it just kind of makes it pop off of the page and use the medium to its fullest potential. And now from the back, I'll kind of feather it out. I don't want there to be too much contrast back there. I'll just do maybe one stroke down, make it super mellow. And that's it. So that's one quick thing I like to do. Make it darker up front by going over a few times, and then fade out towards the back where it's actually much lighter. So speaking about the Faber-Castell paint marker, what I like using this for is actually for the burn marks or kind of lens flares. So what I'll do with this is pick corners that are on my sketch that are in direct, that are in direct path of my light source. So what I'll do is pick a corner and just give it a little dab, and it puts a nice little over-exaggerated flare for where light would actually be hitting that corner. So this is something you wouldn't see in real life, but I just think it adds a nice little dimension to my sketches, and I always add it in just to make them pop a little bit more. And what I'll do on top of that is basically take one of my Uniball white pens, and I'll put a dot right in the center of those, because these are pretty transparent. You can see through it. They just give like the glow of a flare, but this gives a really hard white center, which makes that feel as if it's gradient or gradiating, whatever that word is, out. So that's what I'll usually do for here. I noticed I missed a few, so I'm gonna add one there and there. But this is a nice little tip I like to add to all my sketches. And while I'm doing this, I realized I missed something. There we go. And right here. It's always okay to go back and fix things if you realize that they're not actually present when they should be. So from here, I'm gonna start adding all the details. Basically, something I always do is try and make sure my materials really speak for themselves. So for this one, we're going to use different color browns to make the wood come to life. So we used what's called light walnut before, and a walnut to actually give the, shadows in between each board. But now we're going to use a sienna brown to give a little dot on just a random few number of the boards. What this is going to do is it just implies an imperfection in the wood, some type of knot, and then you can use that later to draw around and really make these feel realistic. So don't put too many, don't make it too crazy. But then what I usually like to do is I'll go ahead and take a very thin marker, and in this case we're going to use a gray marker. I've been using gray markers because they're not as dark, obviously, as black, but not as crazy as white. So the gray markers are ones that are very ideal for wood grain. So for this, we're going to use a Le Pen gray. It's a Japanese company. To go in and just add some lines that go down the wood. Since these boards are so small, we're only going to do about one line per board, just to kind of give that understanding that there's grain. And just make sure that you jog your line around those hard dots whenever you have one. And now do this all the way down. And we're gonna make them squiggle a little bit. If you have a big wide board, make sure you put a few. And then I usually just make them look a little messy down there. And then I'm gonna go and add a secondary color just to hit home there's space between these. Make some look a little darker because they're not all gonna be the same. And then give it a little bit of a shadow going down it. And then give a little bit of shadow in there. And there we go, our wood grain is more or less done. This is an easy one since it's so zoomed out that you don't see much detail on it, but it still really helps to kind of pull the whole thing together. Next thing we're gonna do is work on the concrete. So the concrete floor is never going to be completely homogeneous. Concrete is intrinsically something that is a mixture, so it's going to be really homogeneous, and we're going to have something that has little dots that are going to just make it feel like it is actually made up of sand and gravel and whatever else is in the mix. So we used a C3 before. What I'm going to use now is basically a C4, and I'm going to go through and kind of just give it a little bit of texture. So putting little dots here and there. This is something we're going to do over time with different colors. Like, feel free to add little cracks, because concrete is always going to have mild imperfections in it. And as you get closer to the back, feel free to go back to your C3, because those will be very close to the original color, so it won't be very distracting, and it will help make that back area kind of bleed into the background and not be that important. I like to cover the whole thing in my original color because that one will really blend in, and it will give just a hint of texture, and the darker colors are the ones that will do much more of the heavy lifting. This also kind of makes it feel like it's a flagstone floor, so if I decide to change it, that's not very hard. You just need to take a pen and draw in your lines that are going to show each stone as they're actually set into the floor. But for this, we're going to keep it as our original intent as concrete. And we're going to start adding in some more shadows, anything you think is missing. Because right now we're thinking all about the details. You basically want to have as much contrast as you can. So I started with the floor, got a little distracted, started moving over here, but we're using the same color, so it's okay. And now I'm going to go back to the floor and just add a few details. Because I personally really like super smooth, sanded down floors that are concrete. They just feel really nice. So don't make it too perfect. And that's really it. So now we're also going to do the wood. So the wood in the fireplace, the end grain of birch is always a little more brown, but the surface is white with a little bit of black mixed in there. So this one we're going to give it some contrast to kind of show their shadow. But then we're going to go ahead and use this just to kind of show that there's that kind of grain going on in there. And then we'll go back later with a white Prismacolor marker and pencil to clean the whole thing up. But while we're on the topic of details, we didn't do much with the stones. So the stones up front, gonna give them some shadowing, shadow on the ground as well. Right now I'm just using a C4. We'll go back and slowly add more color. I'm gonna jump it up to a C6, just to add a few areas of imperfection, because no marker exactly right. We're just gonna kind of jump around and see how it feels. The ones on this side, since they're more in shadow, are gonna get more of the C6. But it's also nice to maybe add a little bit of brown in there, just because rocks are gonna have some dirt on them and some imperfections, so figuring out how you wanna distribute that is up to you. But the last thing is then going in and adding some highlight to the whole thing, because the rock is going to have a reflection on it, just like everything else. So adding in a little bit of contrasting white to kind of show these are actually being hit by the same light source is never a bad idea. Okay, so once we have those, we're actually gonna start using our colored pencils. Colored pencils are great for things like this. Like we're using the birch right here, trying to get it a little bit whiter, and good to go. But what I want to start doing with these details is basically showing that there's a light source even more by just having this one little texture. And what this does is now, since the places that are directly in the light source, I can take the side of my pencil and just really quickly add a bit of this rub from the pencil on it, and that picks up the texture of my paper, which makes it feel a little more gritty and grainy and feel real and not so perfect. And it also helps me start just identifying exactly where things are happening. So this one is in the front face, so there's gonna be a little bit more light being picked up. Same with right here. So I'm basically trying to just overemphasize everything that is within the light source. And like I said before, the top of this one is going to be picking up light where the bottom is not. So this will really help to blend those black colors together we were talking about before. And then inside of here, there's going to be more light on the floor than there is in the back, since the back is not in direct sunlight. Right here, there's gonna be the most, because it's outside the shadow. And then blending it into the shadow helps the shadow. Blending into the shadow helps actually make that shadow kind of feel as if it's much more natural, doesn't really have a hard edge on it, and it just kind of pulls the whole sketch together. So this white pencil is one of the last steps that I do. And that's mostly because it's kind of waxy. So if you have a waxy pencil like this, it's very challenging to put the paint markers on top of it that have a very thin tip on it. The fatter paint markers like these guys, they'll go over anything. The ones like this need to go down first if you don't want it to pill up and actually not stick to the page and look kind of crappy. So always try and make this one of your last steps when you're actually doing it. And then I'm gonna go through and at every single one of these, in between, I'm going to add a little light line. And then I'm gonna do it all the way down the back just to kind of make the background of this thing even further bleed out and blend out. Just to make it lighter. Kind of feel like it's in a fog a little bit. And now I'm noticing right here it feels a little darker. So just go back and keep adding it until it feels even. Because you'll get spots that you push too hard on, ones you push too soft on, and you want to make sure that it feels appropriate. And now the same thing goes for the bed. So the bed is white, so we're going to give it a nice little highlight across the top, down the side. And then we're just going to make it white by actually going in and using the pencil to just fill that area in. With some pencil. And the same thing goes for here. It's going to be a little bit lighter going down from the top since there's a window. And always go, even though you spent time making it darker, always put the white over it because the white just acts as this nice little kind of veneer blanket that just makes everything really feel like it's coming together, and it just gets rid of all those little imperfections you have and cleans up the whole thing. So then this guy is going to have white as well, since that's in the light source. And there you go. So that is most of what we're going to do with the color pencil. And the last thing we're going to do is really finish up this cabinetry. The kind of stuff I do last are the interior details. For this one, I'm trying to figure out what I want it to be. And I'm just going to say that all of my kind of cups and plates are this dark gray Heath ceramics material. So I'm just going to, they're not super important. That's why I kind of squiggled them in. So they're just going to get a gray color just to have them be present, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time putting detail on them. And I want my kitchen sink to be a little darker. And now I'm going to say that the top of this is actually concrete as well. So this guy's going to get some of the same treatment we had down here. And I bring this up because since it's interior, we're going to have the reverse of the white, which is highlights, and we're going to have the darker areas. So by doing the exact same thing of taking the side of a black color pencil in the same way that we used the white, now we can start fading it out and making all those areas we were trying to have darkest that were fading to light blend together even more. And it's always good to get it pretty dark right up against another edge. That way it really explains that there's a contrast between those two things. Like under here. And rotate your pencil so you can always have a new flat spot. And I want to make sure that deeper into the building I get, the darker I make it. So over here, it's going to be a little bit darker. And then the same deal over here. In between each of these, I'm just going to add a quick, just to punch home that there's that contrast happening. And now over here, in between each one, gonna get a little bit. And now I just finish this thing off. I'm gonna make these cabinets white because they feel a little left out. Okay, so now this is done. We're gonna try and finish the page by doing some composition work. What that means is basically giving it a name, giving it some actual scenery to put around it that can help us actually fill in the white space and balance out the page a little more. And then we're going to put the last few details like the glass and maybe a little bit of sky or something else just to kind of set it into the actual environment. So the first thing we're gonna do is give it a name. And I always try and write my name out for the concept in a marker first. And that way I can kind of see if I like the sizing of it, where it should go, and I can change it before I actually commit to putting it on paper. So this one I'm going to call it Shift House. Not the most creative name, but it'll do. And then I'm going to go and actually commit to putting down some lines around it so I can start seeing visually how the page is feeling. The trick I picked up a few years ago, and I was just like giving my names a little backdrop shadow. But now what I'll do is I'll take a thicker marker and go ahead and actually, or a thicker pen, and actually name it. So for this guy, I'm going to use this one. I'm going to call it Shift. Try and work on my typography, which is not my strongest suit. It's ironic because my mother is a calligrapher. Okay, so now we can see the page is feeling a little more balanced, and now I can start filling in the actual details, and then we'll go ahead and add some scenery to it. So for this guy, I want to say that the outside is I don't know, we're gonna say dark gray corrugated metal sheets. And then I'm just gonna give myself a little line. Points to it. And then I want to talk about up here, there's this nice little bedroom area. That's what I'm gonna call it an elevated glass bedroom. And then I was going to quickly say there's a fire pit right here. Wood deck with steel fire pit. So something I like to do just to add details and kind of fill in the gaps of the page where it feels a little blank. But now that that's done, I can go in and start adding some actual details for where it's sitting. So this one, I imagine it kind of probably being in a field or somewhere with some grass. And I usually like doing brown grass, maybe things in more of the fall, just because it looks nice. And that's what we're gonna do today. So for that, I'm gonna get a few different browns, and then I'm going to get a few different paint markers. So for this one, we're going to use these two brown Deco Color paint markers, a Uniball Gold and a Uniball White. So to do this, what I'll start doing is basically pick the base color I want the whole thing to be. So for this one, I think it should be a white walnut. So I'm only gonna do a little bit for this, but I'll kind of start picking out a few areas just to kind of give it some grass. And this is super light, so it's something you're not gonna think too much about. And it's okay that you can't really see it over the building because obviously you've spent a lot of time putting markers, and this is going to just drown on top of the marker. So I usually think about it as like little tufts that are coming out of the whole thing. And this is the part that kind of helps to ground it in space. Just give it a little bit of actual feeling like it belongs. And for this guy, I'm actually gonna go and make a kind of a horizon line out of the grass right here. You can get smaller and smaller as you go towards the back, just so it kind of feels like it's ending somewhere. The same thing over here. And since that one was so light, now I'm gonna go for a decently darker one. So I'm gonna go for walnuts, if I can find it, or this will do. This is sienna brown. So using the tip of the chisel, try and get them to be as thin as possible. And then making them smaller and smaller and smaller as you go back. Just kind of make it feel like they're fading into the distance. And I'm also just gonna go and add a little bit of brown on here just to show there's some dirt. Just so it's not so perfect. And then I'm gonna do the same thing with the dirt, keep it going out with a lighter color. Okay, so now what we're gonna do is take some paint markers. So the paint markers are the part that's going to actually make it feel like it's in front of you, and it's actually not blending into the building. So taking a few of these and just strategically placing them really starts popping this up into the front, because now these are all going to show up in front of the building opposed to just bleeding into the background of the whole thing. So I was trying to put a bunch of little tufts everywhere. Don't put too much of one color in the beginning because you're going to use other ones later. Don't forget to make them go in different directions. And now take a different one. and then end with this one and the white. So like 1 or 2 more of those. There's a few dark ones. You just want to build contrast. The same thing with anything you're doing, whether it's a grass, it's some metal, it's wood. You always just want to be layering colors, because layering is where your reality is going to come from. And then end it with a few white ones, just to lighten them up, because the ones you're using can come off pretty dark. So I always like the white, just make them super wispy. And call it a day. So that does most of what we need to do for the actual composition of the page. And the last thing we're going to do now is add the actual, what's it called, shadow that shows that this is glass. So the way I like to do that is basically just taking my ruler and just picking a spot that, trying to specifically target the areas that are darkest, because if you put a white line over a dark area, it'll pop the most. So if I did it only over here, it wouldn't show up very much. But if I do it over this, now I can really show that this thing actually is a line of light that is making this look like glass. So I put that line in, and I'm going to make a very hard shadow. I usually like to put a ruler up against one of my edges so I don't mistakenly get it in the spot I don't want it to be in. Get a nice fresh one that's flat so I can make that blend down. And then conversely, doing the opposite from over here. So it's going to be super hard up there and blend down to there. Basically just lightly covering everything up and finishing it off with a nice hard white line just to really drive it home that that's there. And now doing the exact same process for the other windows. So this is not real how it would be. In real life, you would actually be picking up the reflection of the area around you. This is more of if you were using a light box in some type of photo studio, but it gets the point across and it works, so I just go with it and use it every time. So I'm almost gonna do the same thing where just pick a parallel line from there. Go across, and then just add that white to really make it clear that you're seeing all of this through a pane of glass. And then do the same thing down here where this is actually kind of going up a little bit. Just think you want to cover the darkest parts, because the darkest parts are the ones that are going to be the best contrast for you. And then go back, add that hard line that goes across the whole thing. And then I usually like to add a little kind of mark that is extra thick, which also doesn't make sense, but it kind of just adds a little bit of a lens flare on there just to really explain what is happening right here. And now the same thing's gonna happen up here. So this guy has a shadow or has a highlight as well, since that's glass. And then what I'd probably do just to finish this thing is take a tiny bit of blue and just give like a little, something just to understand there's some sky back there. But that's like a tiny detail. I don't put too much of. because it's very easy to mess up your sketch right at the end when you've spent all this time. You put that one extra detail, which ends up ruining the whole thing. So I think this is it. Something else I want to do. It's always good to take a step back and look at what you're doing and see if you forgot anything. I think what I would probably do is I usually like to go in and add a few little pieces of black gravel just by putting little circles and some dots. But this is all above and beyond. You don't have to do any of this stuff. But once again, it's all about those details. And the more you have patience for, the nicer it'll look. And I'll go and add a little bit of application of dirt. And that's it. Cool. So I think this is done. Thank you, everybody. That was my tutorial on marker rendering with tan paper. I hope you guys picked up some things you can use for your process and add in to make your own style over time. Thank you.